Dear students, so we are again meeting today to continue with our journey with ventricular performance. So there are a number of questions, some of which I will answer today and some of which will be subsequently clarified in our future classes. Now, one of such questions was that whether end systolic ventricular volume or stroke volume. End systolic ventricular volume, in our last class I told you that end systolic ventricular volume is dependent upon several parameters, as for example preload, afterload and inotropic state. So somebody questioned me that end systolic ventricular volume and stroke volume, out of them, or are they good parameters for ventricular performance or not? My answer is yes. If ESVV is low, that means ventricle is pumping hard and ventricle is better evacuated. If SV is high, that indicates again that ventricle is better evacuated. But in spite of that, although they are good parameters, but there are better parameters to express the ventricular performance. Now classically the very good parameter or the usual parameter by which we express the ventricular performance, the usual parameter by which we express the ventricular performance is the ejection fraction. Ejection fraction. What is ejection fraction? Ejection fraction means it is the fraction of total amount of blood which has filled the ventricle that is being ejected with each ventricular contraction. So it is the fraction of blood which is being ejected out of the ventricle, out of the total amount of blood collected in the ventricle, that is known as ejection fraction. So what is the total amount of blood which is collected in the ventricle? At the end of diastole, it is end diastolic ventricular volume. And what is the amount of blood which is ejected out of the ventricle? So that is SV. What is SV? It can be written like that: EDVV minus ESVV divided by EDVV. So this is known as EF. This is known as EF or ejection fraction. And if we simply calculate that, it is around 130 ml minus 60 ml divided by 130 ml, and it is usually expressed in percentage. So it is come around 60 to 65%. So that is the normal value of ejection fraction. So what is ejection fraction? So ejection fraction is the fractional ejection of end diastolic ventricular volume by powerful contraction of ventricle in each beat. So fraction of end diastolic ventricular volume which is ejected out, expressed in percentage in each beat, that is known as ejection fraction, and normal ejection fraction is around 60 to 65%. Ejection fraction may be of left ventricle, ejection fraction may be of right ventricle. So if we recapitulate our definition, a few definitions which are very crucially important for our purpose. First of all is the cardiac output, stroke volume, EDVV, ESVV and ejection fraction. So these are some of the definitions. These are some of the definitions which each of us must remember these are some of the definitions which each of us must remember till the last day of our professional life. That means last day of professional life means last day of our life, because a doctor remains in profession till his death. So at the last day of our professional life means last day of our life. Till then you have to remember the specific definition of all these things. So what is cardiac output? Cardiac output, as per definition, it is the amount of blood which is ejected from each ventricle. Please remember, it is the amount of blood which is ejected from each ventricle per minute, that is known as cardiac output. There are a lot of confusion among the students. We used to ask this question 100 times during our oral examination. 100 times. Define cardiac output. Define cardiac output. Define cardiac output. Every time we ask, in 90% of cases, I tell you, in 90% of cases, we receive wrong answer. In 90% of cases, we receive wrong answer. Either they say it is the amount of blood which is coming out of the heart. If we specifically ask, heart means ventricle. Which ventricle? No, left ventricle. Our students and many people, many doctors have got a peculiar idea that cardiac output is that volume of blood which is coming out of the left ventricle. No. Cardiac output, as per definition, it is the amount of blood which is ejected from each ventricle, either left or right, per minute. That is known as cardiac output. Amount of blood which is ejected per minute from left ventricle is around 5 liter. Amount of blood which is ejected out of the right ventricle is also 5 liter. Please remember, there is a growing and very popular erroneous misconception. There is a very popular erroneous misconception that blood which is coming out of the left ventricle is rather more than the blood which is coming out of the right ventricle. This is completely erroneous. Completely erroneous. Blood which is coming out of the left ventricle and blood which is coming out of the right ventricle are almost same. There may be a bit difference, but is a time-based average. Time-limited average is same. Time-limited average is same, and it must be same. So, cardiac output, as per definition, I expect the students who are attending this class will never commit such a mistake. There is a growing misconception, popular misconception, error that people believe that blood which is coming out of the left ventricle must be more because left ventricle is thicker, left ventricle is more powerful, isn't it? So it is more. No. Left ventricle is pushing the blood in the systemic circulation. What is systemic circulation? It is a greater circulation, highly resistant circulation, high pressure, high resistant circulation, and same blood is ejected into the pulmonary circulation, which is low pressure, low resistance, high resistance level system. So right ventricular cardiac output and left ventricular cardiac output is same. So as per definition, cardiac output is the amount of blood which is ejected out of each ventricle. Please remember, from each ventricle. Each ventricle. Coming out of each ventricle, not only left ventricle, or not from heart, not from both the ventricle, no, from each ventricle. So please remember this very word. Please remember this very word. Even an established physician, established doctor, a postgraduate pass out also, many a time having this kind of misconception. My students will never do that who are attending this class. So this is about the definition of cardiac output. What is stroke volume? Same. It is the amount of blood which is coming out of each ventricle per beat. It is the amount of blood which is coming out of each ventricle per beat, that is stroke volume. So that is the definition of the stroke volume. amount of blood which is coming out of the each ventricle per beat, that is stroke volume. What is end diastolic ventricular volume? End diastolic ventricular volume is the amount of blood which is collected in each ventricle at the end of diastole. Total amount of blood which is collected in each ventricle at the end of diastole, that is end diastolic ventricular volume. And what is end systolic ventricular volume? End systolic ventricular volume, it is the amount of blood which is remain in each ventricle at the end of systole, at the end of ventricular contraction, that is end systolic ventricular volume. And finally, what is ejection fraction or EF? Ejection fraction is the fraction of end diastolic ventricular volume which is ejected as stroke volume when it is expressed in percentage, that is known as ejection fraction. So just to make it a bit interesting, let us give you one example from one example of applied physiology. So we have drawn this curve earlier. Ventricular performance curve, ED, VV and SV, and the curve is looking like this. So with a particular ED, VV, so with a particular EDVV, there is a particular SV, and accordingly, ejection fraction may be calculated. Now, suppose due to any reason whatsoever, or say, let me tell you the exact reason, due to say negative inotropism, with the same EDVV, stroke volume will fall. So with negative inotropism, what will happen? Ejection fraction will be reduced. So in case of negative inotropism, so say if it is normal and it is negative inotropism with the same EDVV, if the stroke volume is reduced, so stroke volume divided by EDVV will become less. So ejection fraction will fall. So when this ventricular performance curve is shifted downwards and to the right or downwards, it will lead to fall in the ejection fraction. So suppose somebody is saying you that my ejection fraction is 20% instead of 60%, which is normal. 60% is normal, it is reduced to 20%. What does it signify? It signifies that with a particular EDVV, the ventricular pumping ability is reduced. With that preload, with a particular preload or with a given preload, the pumping ability of the ventricle is reduced, or in other words, the systolic function of the ventricle is reduced, or in other words, it can be called as systolic heart failure. It can be called as systolic heart failure, or more specifically, it is a systolic dysfunction of the ventricle. Systolic dysfunction of the ventricle. So a low ejection fraction always, so when ejection fraction is low, it always indicates systolic dysfunction. Or systolic heart failure, or pumping failure of heart. So that is ejection fraction. So that is the significance of ejection fraction. Ejection fraction typically indicates the level of systolic function. Now somebody asked me, so this is the answer of a question of your friend. Now somebody asked me another question, if I could remember. Oh, somebody asked me, what is inotropism? What is the mechanism of inotropism? So time and again we expressed that this is the ventricular function curve or ventricular systolic function curve, and this is due to negative inotropism and this is due to positive inotropism. So what is the mechanism of inotropism? That is the question asked by some of your friends. Now inotropism, or in other words, inotropism specifically imply the contractility of the ventricle. Inotropism specifically imply the contractility of the ventricle. Now contractility of the ventricle depends upon several things. Contractility of the ventricle depends upon several things. One of such thing is the role of autonomic nervous system, especially the sympathetic nervous system. So especially sympathetic nervous system is one of the major issue determining the inotropism. So positive inotropic agent, when we call it positive inotropic agent or positive inotropic factor, first and foremost it's sympathetic, and its sympathetic neurotransmitters like adrenaline, noradrenaline, etc. So this adrenaline, noradrenaline, which is acting on various excitatory receptors like alpha receptors, like beta 1 adrenergic receptors, alpha adrenergic receptors or beta 1 adrenergic receptors, etc., and they are increasing the excitability of the ventricular muscles, leading to increased contractility. So there are neural issues and there are also hormonal issues. But in any situation, we shall discuss these issues in more detail when we shall discuss the regulation of cardiovascular system. For the time being, you just remember this much. There are neural issues, there are humoral or hormonal issues which will increase or decrease the contractility. Which will increase or decrease the contractility, or increase the contractility. Decrease in the contractility is usually abnormal. Decrease in the cardiac contractility is usually pathological or abnormal, but there are various physiological situations by means of which the contractility of the ventricular myocytes, contractility of the ventricular myocardium can be enhanced, mainly by sympathetic nervous system and various sympathetic mediated neurotransmitters. So for the time being, we shall remember this much. So this kind of a just 15 minutes, I took around 15 minutes to interact some of the issues you raised in my last class, and here try to enter into the next class. Now I told you to go through something about the PV loop. If I remember correctly, that in the last section of my class yesterday, I gave you to think about, to read about or to search about the PV loop. So today's class is generation of PV loop and to understand its significance in resting state and also various kinds of physiological variation. Various kinds of physiological variation. That thing we try to understand today. Now to understand that, to understand PV loop, we need to understand two things. One thing I told you yesterday, that how a ventricular muscle contracts isotonically as also isometrically. So that part I have covered. One thing I have to tell you, a brief description of cardiac cycle. So a brief description.
হচ্ছে 19 মিনিট 55 সেকেন্ড।
আচ্ছা। So, a brief description of the cardiac cycle is required to understand the PV loop. All of you must have read a basic description of cardiac cycle in high school biology, where physiology is taught. But I will just in very brief, in 5 minutes time, I try to describe, because we have got a full-fledged classes, 1 or 2 classes exclusively dedicated for cardiac cycle. So, what is cardiac cycle? Cardiac cycle or cardiovascular cycle? So, if we think like that, so this is right ventricle, this is left ventricle, this is tricuspid valve, this is bicuspid valve, that is AV valve, this is right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle and left ventricle. This is aorta, arch of the aorta and descending aorta, and this is the pulmonary trunk. So this is the aorta, and this is the pulmonary trunk. Pulmonary trunk is originating from right ventricle and aorta is originating from the left ventricle. Now, as cardiac cycle is a cycle, so first of all, let me tell you what is the duration of cardiac cycle. It is very easy. If I am lying down in resting state, suppose my heart rate is say 75 beats per minute. If my heart rate is 75 beats per minute, then what will be the duration of each cardiac cycle? 60 seconds divided by 75 is equal to 0.8 seconds. So in resting state, so in a state of rest, the duration of each cardiac cycle is around 0.8 seconds. So definitely duration of cardiac cycle is dependent upon, entirely dependent upon the rate of cardiac contraction. If the rate of cardiac contraction increases, then the duration of cardiac cycle will decrease. So when it is 75 beats per minute, duration of cardiac cycle is 0.8 seconds. When it is 200 beats per minute, if the heart is beating in 200 beats per minute, you are running very fast, then the duration of cardiac cycle will be 0.3 seconds. So, duration of cardiac cycle is entirely dependent upon the rate of heart. That is one important information I initially gave you. Now, as it is a cycle, you can start anywhere and can end anywhere. You can start anywhere and end anywhere. So let us start. We customarily start in every book, we customarily start, that is the standard teaching. We usually start with the closure of the AV valve. So there is a closure of the AV valve. So AV valve is closed. Both tricuspid and bicuspid valves are closed. And when the valves are closed, it usually leads to a sound, a kind of sound that is known as heart sound or first heart sound. So this AV valve is closed. But AV valve is closed, but the semilunar valve has not yet opened. Semilunar valve has not yet opened. So AV valve is closed, semilunar valve has not yet opened. Ventricle is filled up with blood. Each ventricle is having around 130 ml of blood. Semilunar valves are closed, and a impulse arrived in the ventricle. So the ventricle starts contracting. So when the ventricle is contracting as a closed cavity, I described yesterday, ventricle as contracting as a closed cavity, it will behave as an isometric contraction, or more specifically isovolumetric contraction. So when there is isovolumetric contraction, it is contracting hard on an incompressible ventricle which is filled up with blood. What will happen? The intraventricular pressure will mount high. Intraventricular pressure will mount high, so much so, it will pass above. It will overcome the aortic pressure. When it will overcome the aortic pressure, what will happen? The semilunar valves will open up. Semilunar valve will open. Semilunar valves will open. So the opening of semilunar valves, and the blood will come out. Blood will start coming out of the ventricle. So blood will start coming out of the ventricle, and that is known as ventricular ejection. Now initially what happens? Initially there is a substantial pressure gradient is developed due to severe sharp contraction of the isovolumetric contraction phase. So there is a severe contraction during isovolumetric contraction phase. So there is a substantial pressure gradient. So as soon as the semilunar valves are opened up, there is a large amount of blood with a very high velocity will gush out of the ventricle or right ventricle, and that is known as rapid ejection phase. But soon after, the ventricular pressure gradient is gradually reduced because large amount of blood has already passed out. It is reduced. So the next ejection phase is known as slow ejection phase. So one is rapid ejection phase followed by slow ejection phase, and ultimately it will eject out the portion of blood that is known as stroke volume. So it was filled with around 130 to 140 ml of blood, and around 70 ml of blood is ejected out as a stroke volume. Rest blood will remain in the ventricle. And at this point, what will happen? The ventricular diastole will start. Suddenly, ventricle starts relaxing. As soon as ventricle starts relaxing, what will happen? The intraventricular pressure will start falling. So as soon as ventricle start relaxing, immediately intraventricular pressure will fall. And when intraventricular pressure fall, the blood which was going out, which was ejecting out, will tend to regurgitate back, return back. Blood which was going out, as soon as there is a sharp fall of intraventricular pressure, that blood will tend to return back to the ventricle. But in its attempt, it cannot do so because there is a valve known as semilunar valve. Let us draw it in blue. Semilunar valve, it is a one-way valve. Whenever it will tend to return or regurgitate, that is the term, regurgitation. So returning. So when this blood will tend to regurgitate, this valve will close. As soon as this blood will close, this regurgitant column of blood will strike back and bounce back. Try to understand this. So ventricular systole was going on. I repeat, ventricular systole was going on. Blood was going out. And as the blood was going out, initially it was very rapid, known as rapid ejection phase. Gradually the ventricular pressure gradient is reduced, so slow ejection phase. And at the end of the slow ejection phase, there is sudden onset of ventricular diastole. So intraventricular cavitary pressure will fall. So this column of blood or ejecting column of blood will tend to regurgitate. This ejecting column of blood will tend to regurgitate, but on its attempt of regurgitation, it cannot do so because there is semilunar valve which is closed, and it will bounce back. It will strike back or it will bounce back against this closed semilunar valve, and it cannot enter the ventricle. So semilunar valves are closed. semilunar valves are closed, but AV valves, atrioventricular valves, these cuspid valves has not yet opened. So what is the situation? It's again a new situation where semilunar valves are closed, but AV valve has not yet opened. So again ventricle is in a closed cavity, but this time it is not contracting, it is relaxing. This time it is not contracting, but it is relaxing. So these ventricular muscles are relaxing as a closed cavity. The ventricular volume is not changing because blood is not coming in, because AV valves are closed. This phase is known as isovolumetric relaxation phase. This is opposite to isovolumetric contraction. So isovolumetric relaxation phase, what is happening during isovolumetric relaxation phase? There is a massive fall in intraventricular cavitary pressure. Massive fall in the intraventricular cavitary pressure. So when intraventricular cavitary pressure is falling down and falling down, so much so, a point of time will come, it will go down below the atrial pressure. We know atrial pressure is very low, 2 to 5 millimeter of mercury only. So it will go down below the atrial pressure, may reach zero pressure. So it will go down below 1 to 2 millimeter of mercury, or may even reach zero. As soon as it becomes lesser than the atrial pressure, there will be positive pressure gradient, atrioventricular pressure gradient, and with that pressure gradient, the tricuspid and bicuspid, the AV valve will open. So as soon as AV valve will open, so what is the onset of diastole? Onset of diastole is the isovolumetric relaxation phase, and at the end of the isovolumetric relaxation phase, this AV valve will open up. When AV valve will open up, then atrial blood will get in. Atrial blood will get in, and that is the starting of ventricular filling. Starting of ventricular filling. Now, in filling, again there are three types of filling phase. First is due to massive pressure gradient, first rapid filling phase, that is known as rapid filling phase or first rapid filling phase. This is the situation when atrium is not contracting. Atrium contains large amount of blood due to filled by vena cava, etc., or pulmonary vein, etc. So there is a pressure gradient and blood will be filling in the ventricle, that is known as first rapid filling phase. But soon the pressure gradient is reduced. So the next phase will be slow filling phase, very slow filling phase, very slow, the fillings are going on. And there is a third phase during which there is an onset of SA nodal rhythm and atrial contraction. So when atria will actively contract and thereby generating lot of pressure in the atria, so it will again push some amount of blood into the ventricle, and that is known as second rapid filling phase. So this is a second rapid filling phase, and ultimately ventricular filling is complete, and at the end of the ventricular filling, these AV valves are closed. So AV valves are closed, but semilunar valve has not yet opened. Again ventricle is in a closed cavity, filled up with blood, filled up with incompressible blood, and there is onset of ventricular contraction and ventricularly contract, and that is again isovolumetric contraction phase, and in this way cardiac cycle is repeating and repeating and repeating. So this is in very brief. I will discuss everything, each of these phase separately when we shall have our classes on cardiac cycle, but for the time being this is a brief description of cardiac cycle so that it will be easier for me to explain the next part of it. So this is about the cardiac cycle. This is well known to you because this is taught in detail in human physiology section of high school biology in 11 and 12, I know, but this is for just a recapitulation. Now let us understand the pressure volume loop. So what is pressure volume loop? Pressure volume loop means, now we are discussing about the whole heart. We discussed a lot at the cell level, individual muscle street level, how they are behaving, etc. Hey Deepak, class nichi go. Pore kotha bolchi? Hello? Hey class nichi. Pore kotha bolchi. So pressure volume loop. So now we are mainly discussing about the whole heart. Whole heart. We had enough discussion on muscle street, cardiac myocyte, etc., etc. So what is pressure volume loop? Pressure volume loop means it is the relationship between the ventricular volume change leading to pressure change during a cardiac cycle. You understand? It is the relationship between ventricular volume change leading to pressure change during a cardiac cycle. So here volume will be taken as independent variable and plotted on the x-axis, and pressure is taken as a dependent variable and plotted on the y-axis. So ventricular volume is in the abscissa and the pressure is on the ordinate. So let us do that. So this is the frame of reference. This is volume and this is pressure. Now, one of the important part of this pressure volume loop is the passive curve or the passive pressure volume curve or the filling curve. So ventricular filling curve is also a part and parcel. Ventricular filling curve is also part and parcel of this PV loop. So how the ventricular filling curve looks like? Ventricular filling curve is looking like this. Just like passive tension curve. So this is the ventricular filling curve. So as the ventricle is being filled during diastole, initially pressure rises not much, but gradually pressure is rising. So this is the ventricular filling curve. This ventricular filling curve is also sometimes called diastolic curve. We know what is systolic curve. This ventricular filling curve is also known as diastolic curve. What is the function of diastole? Function of diastole is filling. So this is ventricular filling curve or diastolic curve. What is the change in diastolic curve in various conditions? We shall take up later. So this is the diastolic curve. So as this ventricular filling is going on gradually, at a particular point, suppose here, the impulse arrived to the ventricle. And as soon as impulse arrived to the ventricle, you just remember my description of the cardiac cycle. As soon as impulse arrived to the ventricle, ventricle starts contracting, or ventricle contracts as a whole as a syncytium. Ventricle contracts as a whole as a syncytium, and what will happen? What will happen immediately? The pressure will rise. Pressure will rise steeply because it is a kind of isovolumetric contraction. Ventricle is filled up with incompressible blood, closed from one side, and it is contracting hard. So immediately pressure will rise high. How long it will rise high? Till it overcome the aortic pressure. What is aortic pressure? It is the pressure of the overall pressure of the say if we are discussing about the left ventricle, overall pressure of the systemic vascular system expressed at the root of the aorta, that means afterload. So when it can overcome the afterload, then what will happen? Then the ventricular ejection will start. So ejection will start means reduction in volume. So volume will be reduced like that. So initially a bit higher, gradually a bit lower. So volume will be reduced like that. So this was the volume accumulated at the end of the ventricular filling, and it is about say 130 ml. And at that point, impulse arised and converted a passive ventricle into an active state, actively contractile organ, but it is happened to be closed from all sides, so it cannot eject. Only thing, there is enormous high or increase in the intraventricular pressure like this, and when it overcome the afterload, immediately the ejection will start. So this is exhibiting the ejection, and at the end of the ejection, what will happen? The seminal valve is closed, but AV valve has not yet opened. So again ventricle is in a closed cavity, but it is now relaxing. So the pressure is falling and falling like a waterfall. So it will falling sharply. It will falling sharply to the end systolic volume, say. So this is EDVV. This is EDVV, and what is this? This is ESVV, or around 60 ml. So this is known as pressure volume loop. This is known as pressure volume loop. So this picture is known as pressure volume loop. Now if we level it, so this is the end diastolic ventricular volume, and this is the stroke volume. This amount is the stroke volume. This amount is the end systolic ventricular volume, right? This is the end diastolic ventricular volume, and this is the end diastolic ventricular pressure. If we consider this line, this is the end diastolic ventricular volume and end diastolic ventricular pressure. This is end systolic ventricular volume and end systolic ventricular pressure. And here somewhere is the peak systolic ventricular pressure. So this is the PV loop. This is PV loop. Now, if we understand this, so this is a PV loop or pressure volume loop, where the filling curve and pressure volume interrelation of a ventricle during a cardiac cycle is very clearly depicted. Now there is another factor. What is that factor? That how this point is determined. That is the issue. To determination of this point. So when the ventricle is contracting, how far and how long the ventricle will contract. Again, that will depend upon another very important issue. Again, that will depend upon afterload. As such, I will tell you. Now, to understand that, you need to understand another issue or a kind of experiment. So, please remember this diagram. I will again draw the diagram. For the time being, I have to erase the diagram. Try to imagine an experiment. It's a whole body, whole animal experiment. The experiment is like that heart is being allowed to contract, heart is contracting freely. Now what they did, they are manipulatively, intentionally increasing the afterload. They are increasing the afterload. Afterload is manipulated and afterload is increased. By any reason. How an afterload can be increased? I can simply tell you how an afterload can be increased. Suppose if we think about the aorta only, say left ventricle. Suppose we are thinking about left ventricle. So here is afterload. That means the aortic pressure is afterload, which a ventricular contraction must overcome in order to eject. So this is ventricle, left ventricle. This is right ventricle. So this is afterload. Now, manipulatively we can increase the aortic pressure by various manipulative technique. One such technique is we can apply some band. We can apply some band here. We can apply some band, decrease the diameter, and thereby increase the resistance. This is one way. There is many such other way. By using systemic vasoconstrictors, that is another way. There are a lot of papers on that. For the time being, you just remember that we can manipulatively, ইচ্ছে করে, উদ্দেশ্যমূলকভাবে, deliberately or intentionally can increase the afterload by experimental manipulation. So by certain amount of experimental manipulation, we have increased the afterload in a quantitative manner. Initially small increase, then large, moderate increase, then large increase, etc. Now as we are increasing the afterload, what will happen? Try to remember the load velocity diagram. That is the load velocity diagram. Load and velocity. So as we are increasing the afterload, velocity of contraction will be reduced. So in case of a high afterload, velocity of contraction will become 0. So if I am increasing the afterload, a point of time will come, ventricle by even most its powerful contraction cannot eject blood, and we can detect that particular afterload which is just sufficient to stop ventricular ejection. So that is the experiment. That is the experiment that to determine that particular afterload which is just sufficient to prevent any ventricular ejection. So we manipulatively was determining the afterload. We are manipulatively increasing the afterload and was determining that particular afterload, that quantitative value of the afterload, which is just sufficient to prevent the ventricular ejection. So that is my experiment. Now if you understand this, then I need to add another point. What is that point? Now it was seen that point of afterload where that afterload which is just sufficient to prevent ventricular ejection, and that pressure of the ventricle is known as peak isometric pressure of the ventricle. So at that point ventricle will contract isometrically because afterload is so high it cannot eject. As it cannot eject, it will contract isometrically. So that is known as peak isometric pressure of the ventricle. Now this, and we can determine that by manipulating the afterload. We can determine the peak isometric pressure. That is the peak isometric pressure of the ventricle where ventricular ejection is stopped and ventricle is contracting isometrically. Now it is seen that this peak isometric pressure varies with the amount of ventricular volume. If before the experiment we are filling the ventricle with certain amount of blood and thereby determining the peak isometric ventricular pressure, then in the next set of experiment we increase the ventricular volume and again determine the peak isometric pressure. Then in the third set of experiment, we further increase the ventricular volume and determine the peak isometric pressure. It will seem that it will have a linear relationship. It will have a linear relationship like this. It will have a linear relationship like this. So if it is like this, volume, pressure, they will have a kind of linear relation. A linear relation like this. So as the volumes are increasing, this peak isometric pressure line is linear. Volume means initial volume. So as I am filling the ventricle with a particular volume, and then achieving the peak isometric pressure, and in the next occasion filling the ventricle with a greater volume and determining the peak isometric pressure, it will give a linear relation. So this linear relation is indicating what? It is indicating the maximum limit of pressure development line. That is the maximum possible pressure development line, because at each volume I am achieving the peak isometric pressure. At each volume of the ventricle I am achieving the peak isometric pressure by manipulatively increasing the afterload. At each level I am increasing the afterload and achieving the peak isometric pressure. Again I am increasing the volume, and then by manipulatively increasing the afterload, achieving the peak isometric pressure, and that will give a linear line. That will give a linear line, and this linear line is determining that point. So with these two conceptions, one is a PV loop with the passive filling curve and this peak isometric pressure line. If we synchronize them, that will give us a clear picture of understanding of this PV loop. So let us do that. So let us do that. How it looks like. So this is the filling curve, and this is the PV loop, and this is the isometric pressure line. So this isometric pressure line is determining this point, isn't it? Because here, when ventricular filling is this much and ventricle is contracting, how long it will contract and increase the pressure till it overcome the afterload. When it has overcome the afterload, it starts ejecting. How far it will eject? It will eject up to that point, because that is the maximum point of contraction of the ventricle in that particular volume. So in that particular volume, that is the maximum point of contraction. So this point, this point can be determined by this line. This line is known as peak isometric pressure line. Peak isometric pressure line. So if by any reason whatsoever, if afterload has increased, then it need to go further to overcome that afterload, and then it will eject. But in that case, obviously the stroke volume will be reduced. So that is the way. So in that way, we can explain everything. I will show you the frame of reference gradually. It is a bit difficult. It may take some time to understand, or time to be explained. But for the time, you remember this much. So this is PV loop, pressure volume loop. This is line of filling, ventricular filling line, and this is peak isometric pressure line. And this is the limit of contraction. This is determining the limit of pumping activity of ventricle. That is the limit of pumping activity of the ventricle, because this is the maximum possible pumping activity in a particular volume that is being experimentally determined. If you just rethink about the experiment again, that means what we were doing? What we are doing? We were manipulatively increasing the afterload. And as we are increasing the afterload, ventricular performance is gradually reduced, and a particular point of time will come when ventricular ejection is stopped altogether. And we determined that afterload which is just sufficient to stop the ventricular ejection. And that pressure, that afterload pressure, expressed in a pressure, is expressed as peak isometric pressure of ventricle in that particular volume, ventricular volume. Now if I go on changing the ventricular volume, if I go on increasing the ventricular volume, it will be seen that peak isometric pressure will increase. With increasing initial ventricular volume, the peak isometric pressure will increase. With further increase in initial ventricular volume, the peak isometric pressure will further increase, and it is a linear. So what that peak isometric pressure line indicates? It indicates the maximum pumping ability of the ventricle in a particular volume. So this is the limit of pumping, limit of activity with respect to a particular volume. So this is called PV loop. This is the loop, and this is the peak isometric pressure line. Now with the help of this diagram, we can explain so many things. Which some of which I will discuss today. As for example, if the EDVV is increased, dhore now the end diastolic ventricular volume is increased. How the end diastolic ventricular volume can increase? Suppose I am doing some exercise. As I am doing some exercise, muscles are contracting. As the muscles are contracting, 1 minute. As the muscles are contracting, it is compressing the veins, and veins are doing one-way blood. So this is a muscle pump. So as the muscles are contracting, the venous return will increase. As the venous return will increase, the ventricular filling will increase. As ventricular filling will increase, end diastolic ventricular volume will increase. If end diastolic ventricular volume is increased, what will happen? The stroke volume will increase. So stroke volume will increase like this. So with the increase in preload, stroke volume will increase. If the preload is decreased, the stroke volume will decrease. So this is a normal preload, this is increased preload, and this is decreased preload. With normal preload, this is normal stroke volume. With increased preload, this is increased stroke volume. With decreased preload, the decreased stroke volume. So just by this diagram here, every time this point is fixed. Every time this point is fixed. What happens in case of afterload? Let us see what happens in case of afterload. For afterload, so this is the isometric pressure line. This is the filling line. Now suppose this is the end diastolic ventricular volume, and if afterload has increased, so it will go further. Suppose normal was this, suppose that was normal. Suppose in case of increased afterload, it will take greater pressure to overcome that afterload, and when at this pressure it is overcome, then the stroke volume or ejection will start, and this is the maximum point. So that will be the curve So that will be the curve. So if this is normal, this is in case of increase after load. So how after load is reducing the ventricular performance? It is very clearly evidenced here. How after load is increasing the ventricular performance? It is very clearly evidenced here. So in that way, so this is a particular frame of reference. If you understand this, in future when you learn medicine, when you learn cardiology, every time these PV loops are brought, and in hundreds of situations, in hundreds of, if I get time, I will give you some of the abnormal situation where these PV loops are changed. I try to show you in a PowerPoint presentation. So there are hundreds of situations where these PV loops are changed, and in that way we can explain that disease also. Now there is a third point, is the inotropism. What happens in inotropism? So let us try to understand that. So this is a filling line, and so this is a normal curve. This is a normal curve. Now in case of inotropism, what happens? This pressure line will change. So this pressure line will be shifted to the left in case of positive inotropism, will shift it to the right and downwards in case of negative inotropism. So if it is shifted like that, so in case of positive inotropism, it will go up to this and then go down. So the stroke volume will increase. In case of negative inotropism, it will go up to this and then go down. So this is about the normal one. This is for the enhanced in case of positive inotropism, and this is in case of negative inotropism. So inotropic factors or inotropic agents will change the isometric or peak isometric pressure line. How it is so, we can discuss subsequently, but for the time being we remember this much. So this is a particular point of particular mode of discussion in cardiovascular physiology with the help of this PV loop and peak isometric pressure line. So this is PV loop. So what are the things? One is a PV loop, another is a filling curve, another is a peak isometric pressure line. With the dynamic interaction of these three, we can clearly explain and elucidate the pattern of ventricular performance in health, in various variations in health, and also in various disease state. So this is all for today. It is already 1 hour, nearly all for today. I understand this is a difficult subject. Please write down your question. I will try to present a very good PowerPoint presentation in my next class if I can arrange. Then all these things will be much clearer, because there are fantastic diagrams are there which I cannot reproduce in the blackboard or in this whiteboard. So that's all for today. Please list your question, give in the group. If there is any urgent matter, you can even call me, no problem. And in subsequent classes, as I am doing every day, at the initial 10-15 minutes will be devoted for the interaction purpose for the last session. Thank you.